We saved the worst for last. We're reviewing the AMD R7 5800X CPU now. It's one of the 4 new CPUs that came out today at time of filming anyway, and that means we've already reviewed the 5950X, 16-core, $800, 5900X, which is a 12-core part at about $550, and then the 5600X, which is the cheapest of the new CPUs at $300. Thus far, AMD has put itself in a pretty strong position. It now has the best gaming CPUs in most of the games that we test. That's a first in at least a decade at this point. And it's also in the top of the production benchmarks. So now we arrive at the 5800X, which is positioned poorly against AMD's own components and struggles to make as much of a value argument considering it's $150 more than the already strong 5600X, and it's $100 less than the very strong 5900X. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic Cooling and its Liquid Freezer 2 line. Arctic is actively restocking its Liquid Freezer 2 coolers that rank among the top performers for CPU coolers right now, including on Ryzen CPUs. The Liquid Freezer 2 series is focused on high thermal performance and value, featuring a blackout design and including a VRM fan mounted on top of the pump block to help provide airflow over neighboring VRM heatsinks. Arctic has also started selling its P12 120 case fans. Learn more at the links in the description below. This will be probably the shortest of the 4 reviews we're doing for the CPUs because by now, if you've seen any of the previous 3, you've already had all the explanation in the charts, so we're cutting a lot of the explanation down to simplify things and focus on the CPU itself. And if you need additional information, you can check our testing methodology documentation that's linked below. There have been some updates for this generation, like new FFmpeg tests and a 3080 FTW instead of a 2080 Ti, but otherwise you can check the 5950, 5900, or 5600 reviews to get further explanation on the tests we're doing. So the 5800X, positioned such that it is sort of reminiscent of the 3700X that we reviewed previously. The 3700X, when it came out, we said was in a no man's land. And it sort of was. It was between the extremely well-positioned 3600 and later the 3300X even made potentially more sense for gaming builds, and then also between the 3900X at the higher end. So when you have a core count increase as large as an 8-core 16-thread CPU up to a 12-core 24-thread CPU, with a price difference that in this instance of Zen 3 is only $100, it does kind of look like AMD is trying to position the 5800X almost intentionally poorly so that it forces an upsell. In the market right now, of course, they're going to sell out of these things regardless. They could have priced all of these $100 more, and they still would have sold out of them because the demand is so high right now that you can get away with that. That's why like a Strix 3070, for example, will fly off the shelves despite being $100 over the 3070 MSRP. Because it's the only thing people can buy, then they're going to buy it just by nature of it being the last one available. So AMD, whether or not it set its prices because it knew all of this, it did have an argument in the performance increases where it was able to increase the performance disproportionately for the price. The incline of the price was less than the incline of the performance, and it overall looks pretty good as a result of that. Let's get into the benchmarks. Again, we're cutting out some of the gaming tests and some of the production tests to just really get straight into the 5800X results, and we'll talk power at the end and then conclusions. We'll start again with frequency validation to determine the behavior of all core frequency under load. Using Blender to produce the workload, the R9 5900X plotted around 4350 MHz after 600 seconds, although it started 20 MHz higher and then had some natural decay from Precision Boost 2 as a result of the temperature increase. The 5600X plotted at about 4400 to 4425 MHz sustained, followed most recently by the 5800X plotting about 4575 MHz sustained after steady state, or about 4600 MHz at the outset. That's the highest of the sustained frequencies so far and will assist in stock performance. Here's the maximum single core frequency per interval in Cinebench R20 single-threaded. The R9 5950X maxed out at 5050 MHz, with the 5900X followed again at 4950 MHz, and again for the 5900X, the dip in the middle is just noise from background test behaviors and can be ignored. The 5600X plotted at 4650 MHz dead steady, as shown in our review of the part, and then the 5800X mostly followed, except at 4850 MHz, but it was still a mostly flat line, and so we're seeing less core switching between the workload. We'll start games again with Civilizaiton 6 as measured in real time with turn time benchmarks. The AMD R7 5800X stock CPU required 27.8 seconds to complete each turn, as averaged against 20 total turns, with the overclock improving only by 0.6 seconds. This is outside of the standard deviation for this test and is actually a real change. It's just not one that anyone will notice. The 5900X outdid the 5800X by 3%, while the 5600X allowed the 5800X a lead of just 6.8%. Considering the 5800X falls between them but is priced at $450, it is difficult to justify. Compared to the 3700X, it is improved by 17%, but what really matters here isn't the generational improvement, but rather how it does compared to its flanking counterparts that also came out the same day. It makes more sense to buy one of those instead of this thing. The 5800X is kind of like the 3700X was at initial launch. It's in a no man's land for most people, and it won't emerge from that place until AMD inevitably drops its price by $80, because it won't sell enough of these. Although for now, thanks to the high demand on the market, they'll keep moving them. Intel isn't really in the conversation that much at this point because we've already talked about their positioning in the last 3 reviews, and it has not changed. AMD is pulled ahead, including in most games, and will remain there until probably first half 2021, and maybe even still then. Time for Intel's one time to shine, and it's in Red Dead Redemption 2, which is the one game that has Intel CPUs holding top ranks still for the game, although generally by 4 to 5%. The R7 5800X plotted at 157 FPS average stock, right between the 5600X and 5900X. In the very least, that's a neatly arranged stack of CPUs and exactly the order we'd expect. It's just that it doesn't make sense to spend $150 more for a CPU that gets you 2% higher performance, unless maybe there's value in non-games and you can't afford the 5900X. But for games, thus far, the 5600X does look like the best value. And it's not even much of a sacrifice. Normally the word value has more of a negative connotation, but here it's fine. The 5800X outpaces the 3700X by about 20 FPS average here, and that's in line with previous comparisons between the 5600X and 3600. Meanwhile, the 10700K competitor maintains a lead over the 5800X of 4.8% in this game, while also maintaining better lows. In Red Dead 2 at 1080p high settings, the 5800X CPU operated at 147 FPS average, but you'll notice that the rest of the AMD 5000 parts also hit this wall. Like we used to see in the last round of reviews, it seems like this game maintains a separate ceiling for performance on AMD and Intel, which may come down to how the game code interacts with the GPUs more than anything else. The 5900X, 5950X, and 5800X are all functionally equal here due to this barrier. In Three Kingdoms and its battle benchmark at 1080p, the AMD R7 5800X stock results had it at 206 FPS average, right alongside the R9 5950X, 5900X, and 5600X stock CPUs. Overclocking plotted within run-to-run variants of the AMD R5 5600X at 4.8 GHz for that one, which makes sense because there isn't much of a core difference between these, and frequencies are now equal. In this scenario, it still makes more sense to just buy the 5600X instead of the 5800X for gaming, while workstation applications might prove more sensibly paired with the 5900X. For reference, compared to the 10700K, the 5800X is ahead by 12%, or 35% ahead of the AMD R7 2700X. As always, of course, it's only worth upgrading if you're unhappy with your current performance, but at least these CPUs do give something to really consider, especially if you're on 1000 series or 2000 series AMD. The campaign benchmark for Three Kingdoms is next, using the Grand Strategy campaign map flyover instead of a battle. The AMD R7 5800X stock performance lands it at 138 FPS average, which is better than might seem sensible when you compare it to the 5600X and 5950X. Except for one thing. In our frequency plot earlier, we showed that the 5800X maintains a higher all-core frequency than these CPUs. And so despite its core deficit versus the R9 CPUs, it maintains a better throughput in this game. It all depends on how well the game balances those cores. If it caps out at about 8 cores, then going to 12 or 16 could actually be more detrimental by way of lower frequency than it would be useful by way of more cores. Compared to the i7 10700K CPU's 115 FPS average, there's about a 21% improvement with the 5800X. The 5600X, however, is close enough to the 5800X at 135 FPS average versus 138 that it entirely invalidates the value of the 5800X part. You'd still be better off with the 5600X for games or the 5900X for production, assuming the budget stretches there. This one will get price cuts later. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p medium, the AMD R7 5800X stock CPU pushed 198 FPS average, a staggering, utterly mind-blowing 1.1747% faster than the 5600X. We added more decimal places to the end of that percentage, which means that it's a larger number and therefore more impressive. Actually, it's more numbers. We take back everything we said about the value of the CPU previously, too. It is worth every penny of that $150 difference to gain 1.1747% more performance than the 5600X. In fact, we need to come clean about being misleading, too. It's technically even better than that. It's 1.17466, 80286% better, which is more numbers and therefore more better. The 5800X overclock got it to 203 FPS average, around where the 5600X at 4.8 GHz ran, and just ahead of the stock R9 5900X. The overclock was worth just a couple percent here, and as for Intel, they lost against the 5600X previously, and they still lose here. So that story hasn't changed, and you can hear more of it in the previous 3 reviews. In F1 2020 at 1080p high, the R7 5800X stock CPU plotted 340 FPS average, ranking it ahead of the 5600X by an actually reasonable amount for once. It's 16 FPS ahead, which, at numbers this high, amounts to about 5%. The overclock pushes another 10 FPS up to 349, and then the 5950X is the only thing above it at this point. But again, it's just tough to justify that $150 for 5% more performance than something like a 5600X. Still, you can see a firm wall where the 5600X OC sits and the 5800X stock sits. There is a bit of a core advantage here. Assassin's Creed is next. This is the only other one where Intel sometimes still holds the lead, depending on which CPU you're talking about. The 10600K and 10700K are actually pretty far down the charts, but the 10-core 20-thread combination of the 10900K seems about right for topping the charts in this game. Ultimately, all of the AMD new CPUs end up in the same cluster, with only the 5600X behind by more than a few FPS. The 5800X does about the same as the 3900X previously, and is followed closely by the 5600X and 10600K. The more interesting number on this plot is the 2700X, which is lagging behind at 109 FPS average. You'd get about a 50% increase in performance to one of these CPUs. The GTA 5 benchmark has the AMD 5800X stock CPU at 134 FPS average, reducing any advantage over the 5600X to just 2.5%. That's $60 per percentage point, which is about as good of a deal as a Titan RTX. The overclock promoted its rank to 141 FPS average, or about equal to the stock 5900X and a few FPS ahead of the overclocked 5600X. Time to move on to the production test for the R7 5800X. We'll start with the V-Ray benchmark, which has some reference points to the 10980XE, 3970X, and 3990X. This is a 3D modeling application that is rendering a scene on the CPU. The AMD R7 5800X stock CPU scored 18,000 points in aggregate, ranking the 10900K as technically faster than it, but the 10700K as slower. The 5800X holds a lead of 24% over the 10700K, and similar over the 4.8 GHz all-core 5600X. Versus the stock 5600X, the 5800X establishes a 36% advantage thanks to its 2 extra cores. Compared to the 5900X, however, where you get a 50% increase in cores for $100 more, the 5800X doesn't look as good. The 5900X completes this work at 26K points, or 43% faster in rendering time than the 5800X when compared stock to stock. The uplift of the 5800X looks good as compared to a 2700X or maybe a 3700X. But beyond that, it just makes more sense to go with the 5600X for gaming or the 5900X for production if within the budget. AMD is definitely pushing for an upsell here, and it makes sense for this one. In Adobe Photoshop, we're testing filters, transforms, warps, blurs, and other effects, and the R7 5800X gets an aggregate score of 1335 points. That's about the same as the 3900X, which makes sense, with the 5950X technically leading from its highest single-core boosting frequency that Photoshop sometimes leverages. The 5600X scores 1259 points, so the 5800X is only 6% better than the $150 cheaper AMD part. 7-zip compression is up now, measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. The AMD R7 5800X stock CPU completed 85.8K MIPS, which puts it at about equal to the Intel i9 10900K results. The stock and OC result for the 10900K were within run-to-run variance and error, and so the real takeaway here is that there was no benefit to overclocking the 10900K in this particular test. The 5800X outdoes the 5600X stock result by 24%, or the 2700X by 59%. Meanwhile, the 5900X outperforms the 5800X massively at 115,000 points, or MIPS, for a 34% lead at $100 more. That's the upsell that AMD is aiming for. The 5800X has more of an argument in these tests than gaming, for sure, but the argument for the 5900X is strong for those who can afford it. In decompression, the 5600X completed 88K MIPS, the OC got to 93K MIPS, and the 3700X outdid those entries at 99.5K MIPS. As for the 5800X, the improvement over the 3700X was 19%, with the improvement over the 5600X at 34%. The 5900X completed 175K MIPS, a 48% improvement over the 5800X, and that's where the 5800X's value looks poor. We're almost linearly gaining 1 percentage point for each 1% increase in core count. Our Blender benchmarks are next, starting with our custom-made GN logo benchmark for a stressful workload on the CPUs. The AMD R9 5950X stock CPU required 9 minutes to complete this render, with the 3950X just behind that, establishing that this test cares more about cores than almost any other test we've done so far. That's because one tile is spawned for every thread, and so there's a direct benefit. As such, the 5800X's time requirement of 16 minutes is meaningfully improved, reduced by 29.3% over the stock 5600X CPU. The 5900X outperforms 5800X CPU's performance by 30%, as we've seen elsewhere, and it lands centered between the two CPUs, but isn't really centered between them in price. The GN Monkey Head render is easier for these CPUs, but sometimes sees a repositioning of the hierarchy. Here, the 5900X completes the work in 9.4 minutes, outpacing the 5800X's 13-minute result by 30%. The 5800X completes the render in about the same time as the 10900K, and about 19% less time than the 3700X. We'll skip a couple tests since we've established a pattern here. Finally, here's the Chromium code compile benchmark. If you want FFmpeg, check out our other tests. The 5800X completes the code compile in 80 minutes, which has it almost equal with the 10900K stock CPU and only improved over the 3700X by 10%. The 5900X does this job in 57 minutes, a 30% improvement over the 5800X, and as for the 5600X stock CPU, that's down at 108 minutes. Finally, for power, the AMD R7 5800X stock CPU consumed 127 watts in the Blender all-core workload, which is about the same as the 10900K. That makes it more efficient than the 10900K in just about every workload, including games in almost every instance. The 5800X OC we set only consumed 124 watts here because we were able to tune the voltage to 1.306 volts of get for V-core. The 5900X stock CPU pulled 133 watts, so basically the same as the 5800X. And the 5600X drew about 67 watts, making it definitely the most efficient for all of these gaming tests. So that's it for the AMD R7 5800X. Just like the 3700X, this one's in a bit of a no man's land. If you're building only a gaming computer, just look at the 5600X. Maybe wait around a little bit if you feel like it for whatever their $200 option ends up being. They'll definitely have one. Or, well, there's not much reason to go Intel right now. You could maybe consider not even really a 10600K. The 10900K kind of holds on in some of these games, but 5600X makes a lot of sense for gaming-only builds right now. As you get up to the higher end, sure, you can kind of get a couple extra FPS out of a 5950X sometimes, but not always. It depends on how the game leverages those cores, and sometimes it may end up being worse just because, well, the games don't necessarily deal with 16 cores that well. For non-gaming, for production stuff, clearly the 5950X is the winner. There's nothing even close to it, really. The 10980XE isn't close to it. You need to move up to Threadripper class parts to outdo the 5950X. But at $800, you're probably not looking at that part if you're considering the 5800X today. So the people who should maybe buy the 5800X would be those who want to build a production system and can't quite make the extra $100 to reach the 5900X. If that extra $100 means you have to take it out of your GPU budget and you do stuff with CUDA and optics and things of that nature, and you can actually benefit from a higher end GPU, then sure, 5800X plus a 3080 instead of a 3070 does in fact make sense for those use cases. But for everybody else, if you're a professional user and you can justify to management, or if you're maybe a freelancer and you can justify it because it's going to reduce the amount of time your computer spends rendering projects, then the 5900X does in fact make a lot more sense at $100 more, and the value is much stronger. So those are the two we're looking at: 5600X, 59 if you can afford it. 5800 is really only there if you really can't stretch to meet the 5900X, which is fine. It is an option. It's got higher cores than the 6-core part. It just doesn't feel quite as good to use for a production workstation type system as a 5900X that isn't percentage-wise that much more compared to, say, a true HEDT part. So that's it for this one. It's the odd man out, just like we said about the 3700X, but assuredly AMD will drop the prices by $80 or so as soon as these get stuck on the shelves once the sell-through rate slows down. But for now, they're going to keep moving 100% of all the units that they restock. Thanks for watching. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, like by buying one of our mouse mats, mod mats, or our new GN bar runners, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for behind-the-scenes videos and patrons Ask GN episodes. We'll see you all next time.